So I'm Miles Rappaport. I think everybody knows me, but and this is the third in the Learning Our History series. Some of you have been at all of them, but the first was on the labor movement of the 1930s, second on the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and today is about the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement that grew up to oppose it in the latter part of the 1960s. For me, it was, I'll give a little bit my own history. I was actually in high school in 1965 and 1966 as the war escalated.
You missed so much fun.
I caught up as best I could. And immediately got active. I was the president of Great Neck Students for Peace in Vietnam out on Long Island, and became very actively involved in opposing the war. Did it through college, where I met Michael and Sarah, who you'll hear from later, and continued to be active in it. And what I really wanted all of the younger staff people here to know about was sort of what the ethos, what the aura of the time was like, because it's really so different. I mean, in the sense that, for me at least, it was a awful and really genocidal war being waged by a Democratic president, which colored everything that we thought about American democracy, what the system was, how it worked, whatever, in a way that's very different from today. And I think that it's really, I want sort of the younger people to sort of understand what that moment was like, what the movement was like. It had lots of things that were similar in some ways to the social movements of today, a lot of things that were different, but a really kind of very special and very unique sort of characteristic of what the feeling was like. So for me, and I know all three of the panelists, we've been friends for a long time in one way or another, having three people who really were at the core of that movement would be a really interesting thing for the people who are now working on at Demos and in associated organizations to hear about. So I'm very, very excited that all of you are here. So let's go around. Let's start. I'll come back around to the panelists, so we'll hold. Joe, start with you. Name, rank, serial number, and something you want to learn about that period. And speak loud, because we won't have the, well, we can have the mic going around. Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Very quickly.
I'm Joe Hines. I work in communications at Demos. And I guess one thing I'd want to know about the Vietnam era and the New Left, I guess, is like the extent to which you think the Vietnam War was informing the movement as a whole, and the extent to which you think economic issues and insecurity was actually motivating people. Because I'm still kind of curious about that, and I feel like it's much different today.
I'm Brandon Stinchfield. I'm a Foundation Relations Associate at Demos. And I think what I'd like to hear about is the intersection of the anti-war movement with the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, and just how they overlap.
And let me thank Brandon again for being the teaching assistant, including the soundtrack for this course. Brandon, thank you very much.
So my name is Ngozi Okaro. I'm a guest of Demos, and I don't have anything specifically that I'm thinking of as an outcome for today, but I originally thought that I wasn't going to come to this session, but once I read the materials, I decided I couldn't not come. So I'm just really happy to be here and ready to learn, and thank you for the opportunity.
I'm Michael Winship. I'm a senior writing fellow here at Demos. I'm also president of the Writers Guild of America East, which is a AFL-CIO union, and senior writer of Moyers and Company on public television. I was kind of a foot soldier during the anti-war movement. I was very involved as a student at Georgetown in the October and November moratoriums in 1969. I was a marshal for the student mob during the National Student Strike in 1970 after Kent State and Jackson State. And then involved in several other things, including the May Day demonstrations in 1971 and the demonstrations that took place leading up to that. And my draft lottery number was 1.
Hi, I'm Scott Malikowski. I'm a lawyer here at Demos. I don't really have any specific questions. I just think I always love hearing directly from people who have experienced this stuff. It's one thing to sort of read about things in a book, but I think it's different and always a great experience to hear firsthand from people who were there.
My name is Alex Knopp. I'm a former legislator and mayor from Connecticut. I served with Miles in the state legislature. I currently teach at Yale Law School. So in 1965, I signed up to be a conscientious objector against the war and was active in almost every organization and activity from there till the end of the war. Something that might add some value later on was I did get a fellowship to travel later on and ended up doing research for a book about the impact of the Vietnam War in Europe. And unlike here where there was no draft, there was no money, there were no casualties, all the things you think about that are needed to sort of generate a protest movement, there was a very, very large protest movement in Europe, even though none of those material things were involved. And I've been glad to talk about why and the kind of impact of that on the American strategy.
My name is Jeff Malikowski. I work in Washington as a social change philanthropist, a funder. I like to think I'm one of the younger people that Miles was talking about. I signed up for the anti-war movement in late 1974 when I went to start school at the University of Michigan. I quit school by the end of 1974. I might be the last guy that turned on, tuned in, and dropped out. And I've been engaged full-time in organizing of some kind or another ever since. So I'm interested to hear your views on the current day compared to when you began. I began very late in the game. I'm interested to hear about early in the game.
Hi, I'm Electra Gray. I'm also in the communications department at Demos. I don't really have any specific questions, but I think my interest comes from having been born sort of at the tail end of the Vietnam War, so around enough to kind of feel it in the conscious of my family and my surroundings, but not enough to really understand it. So being able to hear it kind of more firsthand in less history books is of interest to me.
My name is Gwen Ellsworth. I'm in communications at Demos, and I'm also kind of interested in getting the sort of personal context and the personal narrative that accompany some of the things that I've studied, but I wasn't alive at the time, so I'm really interested on that end of this discussion.
Hi, name's Alex Amond, also in the communications department. These are brand new microphones I'm very excited about. It works. Test them out here, yeah. Just thrilled to hear your personal experiences. I recently finished Michael Hare's Dispatches and have really, kind of only interacted through books and some documentaries and films like that. So it's great to have you here.
Hi, I'm Walter Nagle. I'm currently working part-time for the American Friends Service Committee, and I also run a small private foundation called the Bayard Rustin Fund, named after my late partner. I was a draft resistor during 1968-69, refused to go into the service, and I guess I'm here today to sort of look back at that time and see how it looks from almost 50 years later.
My name is Angel Fuentes. I'm a retired social worker. I was around marching in the Pentagon at the time, listening to the Beatles outside on the street. But what I really want to know is, my concept of history has changed. I used to detest and demonize LBJ, and the older I got, the more complex figure he became for me. So I guess what I'm interested in is how has our view or perception of the Vietnam War changed over the years in terms of history?
Hi, I am Reniqua Allen. I'm a fellow here at Demos and also a freelance journalist. I'm definitely interested in the personal stories, but having been around and fairly young when the Iraq and Afghanistan wars broke out, I'm interested in movements and political movements and why it seems to me, it was a different vibe in the air. There was a spirit of resistance, but it never seemed to take off quite in the ways that the Vietnam protests did. So I'm interested in kind of the parallels to today and yesterday.
Hi, I'm Danny Millstone. I was involved in the very early SDS and don't understand why and how the war in Vietnam sucked all the air out of the movements for social justice that we felt we were right on the edge of winning.
I'm Joanna Parson. I'm a guest of Demos and a daughter of a Demos staff member. All of the connections that she will tell you are the only ones that I have, one removed. I'm always interested in, as you said, what in the ethos then versus the ethos now, and what was the feeling of having an effect, and like what were the little wins that kept people going on this kind of thing that we don't seem to build momentum on today.
My name is Donna Parson, and I work at Demos. I was not involved in the anti-war movement, and I'm really interested in hearing Cora talk about the role of women in the movement.
Hi, I'm Liz Jameson. I'm in development at Demos. I'm always really interested in the way that basically the tension and interplay between the moderate parts of social movements and the radical parts, and the way that those interact and sort of push each other towards change. So if anyone can speak to that.
I'm Caitlin Endyke. I'm a program associate at the Building Movement Project, which is an affiliate of Demos upstairs. So I was a history major in college, and I focused kind of exclusively on social movements of the 60s and 70s. So I guess I kind of have a pretty general interest in it all, but not really any super specific questions, but I was kind of always interested to hear more.
My name is Roseanne Mayer-Perham. I work at the Reproductive Health Access Project, and I learned about this through Caitlin. I'm also a Colin Powell Fellow from City College, where I'm studying international relations. And my project for the fellowship is to understand how the reproductive rights movement, which I'm very passionate about, can learn from movement building in other social justice issues. So I'd love to cross-apply some of the things I learned today.
I'm Peter Weiss. I'm an international and human rights lawyer, and I went to Vietnam in the middle of the war at the invitation of the Hanoi Bar Association to do an investigation of human rights violations by Americans in the war, and my colleague Mort Stavis and I gave a report when we came back to the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. And while I was thinking of what I should say here, it just occurred to me, I think for the first time, that one of the things that was new about the resistance movement against the war in Vietnam was that international law played a big role in it. And I think from then on, international law has played a big role in all movements opposing wars.
Michael?
Good evening. I've come up to Washington. I came from Washington. I'm Michael Lipsky. I'm a fellow at Demos, a former staff member. I live in Washington. When Miles sent out the announcement saying that Cora Weiss was going to be on a panel to talk about the Vietnam, I said, well, I've been at every other event of that sort. I have to come to this one. So I'm so pleased to be here. I was a civil rights activist, doing a lot of work in Princeton and then at Wisconsin. And it's so interesting that our colleague said, talking about sucking the air out of the other movement, because I did experience a kind of disappointment that the work that we were doing in civil rights seemed to be less important to students and others whose agendas were changing. And I couldn't and didn't, I was a supporter of the movement, and I was on all sorts of marches and whatnot, and we talked about it in classes and so on. So it's not as if I didn't understand what was going on, but there was something about the way in which the movements in that period cascaded over one another that had some implications that are pretty interesting. Be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a great idea. My name is Carolyn Meyer. I'm currently a Demos Fellow. I learned tonight from Miles that it's a lifetime commitment, which I hadn't realized. I also teach law, although hopefully going into semi-retirement soon. I was a member of SDS and the Gramsci Collective with, well, Donna's not here, but Miles and others in that era in Boston. I just wanted to speak to one quick thing about, because I think this is a really important point about the overlap of the movements. I do think the Vietnam War movement, and to a certain extent the civil rights movement, generated the women's movement. And certainly it was our awareness that we were running the mimeograph machines and getting purple hands while the men were speaking on the podiums that really had a lot to do with creating Roses, which was the first umbrella women's organization, and my little piece of it, which was called the Red Coven. And so I'm looking forward to more discussion of that.
My name's Josh Freeman. I teach history at Queens College at the Graduate Center, and I was involved in the first session in this series, which was on the labor movement, and I just want to congratulate Miles for doing this. I think it's actually quite unusual and terrific that he's organized this series. I was with Colin and Miles and a couple other people in this room as a kind of foot soldier in Boston in the anti-war movement, and like a lot of people, I did pretty much whatever Michael and Sarah told me to do, and it worked out reasonably well, I think. So I'm interested to see what others have to say about that.
My name's Debbie Bell. My background is somewhat different, my young background. I grew up in an anti-FDR Republican household in Washington, D.C., and was, in fact, a segregated city at the time, perhaps still to some extent. And my activism started in connection with the civil rights movement. I also grew up good friends with the children of elected officials who were planning the bombing of Haiphong, et cetera. And, you know, had a growing sense of horror at what was going on, but did not find an outlet for acting on it until I went to college, and was one of the foot soldiers with Miles and Josh and Carlin and Donna Lieberman, who will show up shortly, and following Michael's instruction. But I want to make a point. I currently run the labor union that represents the faculty at the City University of New York. It's 25,000 people. We're an AFT local. And I've been in the labor movement since college. And really what pulled me into the anti-war movement in college was making posters. And something that taught me that I have tried to perpetuate in my practice in the labor movement, and I think my colleagues will agree with me, we had a lot of fun. And that fun is really a part of building a movement. And that engaging people in doing things that put forward ideas, like making posters, which you can still silkscreen, which you can still, I mean, we still make them with markers every time we're going someplace, is really important. And I want to acknowledge Michael for having a sense of fun. It may not come through in this discussion, but he always did. Always did. And, you know, I carried it forward as best I can.
I'm Joan Vermeulen. I worked with New Haven Draft Resistance, and in the spirit of having fun, I was the coordinator of the weekly Draft Resistance dinners. And otherwise, like many people here, a foot soldier in the resistance to the war. I came because I'm just really curious to hear the perspectives on what we did and what we didn't do, and what we might have done different and what we did well.
Well, I'd say this is a really nice blend of the of people from those days and these days. And I guess I just want to say this is sort of to the Demos people, which is that I really feel like there is a connection, that the work that we do at Demos and that other organizations do is in fact in the tradition of making the world a better place, making our economy and our democracy more just and inclusive. And so I don't feel at all like having a discussion like this is living in the past. I feel it is informing the present and hopefully inspiring our future. So I'm delighted that we have this blend here. And so let me introduce the panelists. in the order in which they're going to speak. The first is Todd Gitlin, who is a professor and chair of the PhD program at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He was the third national president of SDS, an early anti-war organizer, and as Michael informed me, was the architect of the strategy to go up against Chase Manhattan Bank for their involvement in apartheid in 1965. And I can tell you that the very first demonstration that my brother dragged me to in 1965, long before I got active myself, was at the Great Neck Chase Manhattan Bank branch protesting apartheid. So Todd, you've inspired me even without knowing so. Anyway, and Todd is a historian and has written what I consider, I said in the invitation, the best book about the 60s that I've seen, called The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, and I think that he can do a really interesting framing of the whole period. Second is Cora Weiss, who is an absolute hero, a non-gender specific word I might point out, of the Vietnam War movement. She was the co-founder of Women's Strike for Peace, which was one of the most passionate and powerful and effective organizations, and really was just a charismatic leader at the time who, among other things, and Peter mentioned this, really had a connection to the North Vietnamese government in ways that actually she was the first person who arranged for mail delivery to American prisoners of war in Vietnam, and also helped to secure the release of several POWs. So if you want to know who was one of the people who was at the absolute epicenter of those days, it's Cora Weiss.
There were lots of epicenters.
Yes. And Michael Ansara, who has been a personal friend of mine for 40 years, was my mentor when I first joined the anti-war movement, and my colleague at Mass Fair Share, was really one of the charismatic leaders of the Students for a Democratic Society at Harvard and in New England and nationally. Was a clear-headed strategist when we desperately needed that for the anti-war movement, and as you can hear, he ordered a lot of people around merely by the sheer force of his personality, and has been active and smartly strategizing ever since. So I've asked each of the speakers to talk for maybe 10 minutes, trying to keep it brief enough so that we can have a real discussion, and we'll see where it goes from there. So Todd, you're on first.
So,
Todd Gitlin.
I decided to have some fun with this. So the way I'm going to have fun.
He heard you, Debbie. He still was taking fun.
One way in which I'm going to have fun is by making an argument.
By the way?
Hmm?
Is this mic on?
Yeah.
Okay. Bring it a little closer. Yeah.
I'm going to have fun by not repeating myself. So I have written voluminously, ad nauseum is another way of putting it, about the dynamics of the 1960s and the anti-war movement and how demonstrations led to demonstrations and the dynamics of moderates and radicals and so on and so on. And I'm happy to talk about any of that, but it's not really what I want to talk about. Actually, I'm going to pick my I'm going to take as my starting point a couple of the observations that were made. Somebody asked what was it that kept people going. There was a lot of things, including fun and making posters and so on. But the central thing to grasp about, there are two things I think to grasp about the anti-war movement overall. The one is that it follows directly on the heels of, and is in some ways the offshoot, and as some people have pointed out, is in some ways the negation of the civil rights movement. There was already a movement. There was already a movement that was called the movement. You knew if you were in it. It numbered, let's say, maybe 1 million people nationally who did anything from register voters in Mississippi to march on a picket line protesting segregation at a lunch counter. And history, oddly, made it possible, made it, in fact, imperative for what I think of as a sort of the moral energy of the civil rights movement, which was a profoundly moral movement, to be converted into another sort of channel of moral sentiment. But this was I think these movements together amounted to a moral regeneration movement, or what some historians of religion in America would consider an awakening of the proportions comparable to what took place in the 18th century and in the early 19th century and at the turn of the 20th century. This was huge, and what drove it was the feeling of moral necessity. The second thing that I think it's important to understand is that it lived in the movement. I think, among others, have written, partly for convenience sake, have tended to write the history of the 60s as a history of organizations. But I don't want to talk about organizations here. I actually want to talk about a lot that was happening, the many epicenters, which is a central feature of this movement. It was many epicenters. And it's important to understand that these epicenters were held together by the sense that they were part of a saturating culture. There was a pervasive, I think Miles, you used the word aura. It was sort of an embodied aura. You knew you were in it. Just a random personal anecdote that just popped into my head. In the fall of 1968, I was the way we often traveled was by driving people's cars across the country for gas money, and that's how people transported their cars. And so my girlfriend and I were driving from New York to the Bay Area where we lived, and the car broke down in Nebraska. And not only was it in Nebraska, but it was about 40 miles west of Lincoln, where I knew no one. Neither of us knew anyone in the state. So we went to the movies to see Rosemary's Baby, and then we figured out the only way to turn the car in, the guy said sell it, but the one Simca dealer in Lincoln was a Seventh-day Adventist, and it was a Saturday, so he was closed. So we had to stick around Saturday night. We had no money. So we got a ride to the campus of the University of Nebraska, where I knew nobody. And I walked onto the campus, and I saw a guy wearing a resist button, the Omega, which was the emblem of the draft resistance movement. And I just went up to him, and I explained who I was and what I was doing there, what we were doing there, and asked if he could put us up. And he said, yeah, and he did. So that's what I mean by an all-suffusing culture. Now, I want to enumerate some of the epicenters that were important and have probably gotten relatively short shrift in the history. So without any sense of priority, Cora is going to talk about the Women's Strike for Peace, I think, so I won't say anything except to say that they were important in a number of respects, and they were autonomous, they had their own directions. They were able to do things and be things that the student-based movement was not. An organization was founded in probably around 1964, 65. Originally, I think it was called Clergymen Concerned About the War in Vietnam or something. Eventually, it went through various name changes. It was no longer clergymen, it became clergy, and then it was clergy and laity. I think it was originally clergymen and laymen. In any case, it was an organization of clergy and people who identified through religion, who had their own activities, who were involved in many churches and synagogues and whatnot, often in collaboration with other groups, but they had their own dynamic, they had their own language, they had their own periodicals, and so on. I'm just now reading, as some others of you may be, doing the new book by Betty Metzger called The Burglary, which is about the liberation of the FBI files from Media, Pennsylvania in 1971. And she was one of the first reporters to learn about these people. They had stolen the whole FBI archive out of an relatively unguarded suburban office. They constituted themselves as a citizens committee or commission to investigate the FBI. They sorted through all these documents. They got away with it. Nobody knew who they were. They never surfaced until recently. Betty Metzger's book tells us that they were a group of 8 or 9 pacifists led by a Jewish Quaker physics professor at Haverford College. They kept the secret, actually, until some of them blurted it out a few years ago. They overlapped with they were from Philadelphia, and they overlapped with sort of the more mainstream anti-war organizations, but they and groups like them who did things like pouring blood on draft board files and otherwise obstructing the smooth operations of the draft, which were very important, and they organized as independent, resistance nodules. GIs have been written about, not nearly enough. There was a whole auxiliary world numbering vast numbers of soldiers, of enlistees and draftees on bases around the world. There was a network of GI newspapers, hundreds of them, which helped pretty much undermine the ability of the armed forces to fight any longer in Vietnam. One of the most efficacious segments of this movement. I mentioned briefly draft resistance. We know it was smaller in number than these, but extremely vigorous. Cadres came through there, very important. Some of them went to Canada, most of them didn't. There was in 1970 a demonstration in Los Angeles called the Chicano Moratorium, which was one of the largest demonstrations of the period and was confrontational enough on the police part that they actually opened fire and killed a Chicano newsman. In general, this falls by the wayside, partly because it was in Southern California, partly because it wasn't the white mainstream, but it's also a segment of this, and there were African-American equivalents. Your story sort of touches on one element I want to mention. Almost every elite political family in America was riven by the war in Vietnam. It was always on the dinner table. The top leaders, McNamara, Bundy, had children who stopped talking to them. McNamara, if you may remember in the Fog of War movie, Errol Morris asked him what about his family. He said, I won't talk about that. He had a son who went off to California, started a walnut, sort of a hippie walnut ranch, and I don't know whether they ever got back in touch, but every time these, I had a student of mine at Berkeley named Tom Wells wrote a dissertation which became a book about the anti-war movement. He interviewed a lot of the political leadership of the war, and he found this over and over again. The high officials in the Pentagon, in the State Department, they were all fighting with their kids. Don't think that was unimportant. It was very important. It put the issue on the table, literally on the dinner table every time. We have now a new book from a colleague of Josh's, I guess, Penny Lewis, about the role of working class resistance. Again, no time really to give it its due, but there were a lot of, despite the general pro-war reactionary operations of George Meany's AFL-CIO, there were lots of outliers, lots of dissenters, and not only in public opinion, by the way, working class people were more likely to oppose the war than people with college educations. True in public opinion. And lots more to say about that. And then also this touches on something that came up. In every profession, lawyers, doctors, professors, engineers, scientists, teachers, there were cadres of people who were epicenters in their respective worlds. So that was what the anti-war movement was. And I just want to just throw in 2 more points quickly. One is goes to your question about have my perceptions of the Vietnam War changed? The answer is absolutely not. I understand Lyndon Johnson differently now, and I now understand him as a tragedy and not a monster, or a tragedy as well as a monster. At the time, I was completely blinded by the war. But I think I think I don't know how Robert Caro is going to come out on this, but I am quite convinced that Johnson eradicated his own meaning in our collective history with this insane commitment to the war, and that he would have been one of the greats without it. I mention this to say that, I guess also to address Michael in the sense that something happened in 1964-65 which is integral to the history of the period, and it has to do with, in a variety of ways, the transition, which to me is still quite important, from the early 60s to the late 60s. And in my book, I did, I think, somewhat symbolically identify the turning point as August 1964, because two things happened that month. One was the Tonkin Gulf Institute, incident, which was the anteroom to the war. And the other was the Atlantic City Democratic Convention, where the radicals of SNCC and CORE and others were rebuffed, were offered a compromise they considered insufferably lame. And at that point, the moderate radical split or division or friction, which had always been in place, began to mushroom and eventually becomes the template for the rest of the history. I've overfulfilled my quota.
Thank you, Todd. Cora?
I guess if one lives long enough, you can start talking about the past, which is history. I'd love to hear about the future. So, every war has been a time and a place for civil society to do something unique about the war. In the Second World War, you all know, people took great risks to hide Jews in Europe. So what I want to talk about is the unique thing that happened during the Vietnam War. First, I want to remind everybody that Vietnam is a country, not a war. And I think we have to remember that when we talk about Vietnam. I loved the use of the phrase cascade, of the cascading movements, because I came out of the civil rights movement. I was the treasurer of Dr. King's Gandhi Society for Human Rights and the African liberation struggle, and ran an airlift from East Africa to this country, which was very, very controversial. And I was a pal of Bayard, and I want to shout out a salute to him. But that was an interesting thought, and then I just quickly wrote down all the movements that flowed from one into the other. So from civil rights to the anti-war movement to the women's movement, we've seen it. But I want to particularly focus on a unique, creative, chutzpahdik action that Women's Strike for Peace took. Women's Strike was started in 1961 by the wife of a British consular general in Washington who had 3 daughters and got frightened to death that America was testing nuclear weapons from the atmosphere, and the radiation was going on the grass, and cows ate the grass, and in those days we fed our babies cow milk. And we sent our teeth to, what's his name from Cleveland, the guy who ran for president? God.
Barry Commoner.
Thank you, Barry Commoner. And he tested the teeth for the presence of strontium-90, and we went around the country teaching newspaper editors how to spell strontium, and a grassroots campaign began. Fast forward in October of '63, when Jack Kennedy signed the Half-Ban Treaty, the treaty that abolished atmospheric nuclear testing. We were witnesses at the gate of the White House and thought we had succeeded, not having a clue that you can test underground and in laboratories, but we were pretty happy about the Half-Ban Treaty, and he was so thrilled that, do you remember Jerome Wiesner? Jerry Wiesner was his science advisor, and he said to President Kennedy, look, their women are standing outside, and they helped make this day happen. And Jackie Kennedy was sent out with coffee and donuts. We used to eat donuts in those days. And And all of that was interesting. Did I say 73? I meant 63, October 63. So in any event, fast forward, the war against Vietnam began, and women's strike split. There were those who wanted to continue being a disarmament organization, an anti-nuclear organization, and those of us who said, we can do that, but we've got to stop this war. It's illegal, it's immoral, it's unjust, and we've got body bags coming in, and there's no justification for it. So we were in touch with the women of Vietnam, North Vietnam. And on July 4th, our greatest patriotic holiday, 1969, we met with Vietnamese women in Canada because obviously Vietnamese women couldn't come to the United States. And we were all sitting on the grass of a lovely farm in Canada, licking ice cream cones, and all of a sudden a Vietnamese woman from the north, there were women there from both north and south, women from the south who had walked north to get out, said to me, would you like to come to our country? This is the height of bombing. The bombing of North Vietnam started in '64. The first prisoner of war was taken, Eddie Alvarez, a Latino, in '64. The foot soldiers were in the south. It wasn't a foot war in the north. I don't have to tell you the history. I'm sure you all know it. And I had 3 little kids and a husband at home. And I said yes. And that began an extraordinary history. We left after what you called the second moratorium. It was the mobilization, November 15, 1969 in Washington, when a Democratic, I was talking to Alex about that, Democratic George McGovern held hands with Republican Goodell from New York and led the demonstration, which was considered the turning point in public opinion in this country about the war. And Peter Yarrow, whose song we heard earlier, thank you for the music, I cried when I heard Phil Oakes. Peter Yarrow and I were sort of central to that in terms of the program. And from there, we left for Hanoi. 3 women, Madeline Duckles from California, Ethel Taylor from Philadelphia, and me. And a small group of us had met before we left because Melvin Laird, Secretary of Defense, and Richard Nixon, President of the United States, were promoting the war, which had no basis, by talking about Vietnam. The Vietnamese are torturing our prisoners of war. Well, if we hadn't been flying over Vietnam and dropping bombs and they weren't shooting them down, there would be no prisoners of war. But the Vietnamese are torturing our prisoners of war, A, and B, they're not going to let them out. So the POW issue became, for a while, because the issues changed that were responsible for escalating the war. So the POW issue became the issue at that time for promoting the war, for justifying it, and for escalating it. So 6 of us met. I can't remember who they all were. Stuart Meacham from Friends Service Committee, Dave Dellinger, myself. I was always the only woman in those days. I was the Women's Strike for Peace representative, quote, to the movement, and my job at the movement was to make sure that the demonstrations were safe for families. And I used to not leave the meeting until I could get that assurance. And that was pretty important. But I was a co-chair of the mobilization with 3 or 4 guys and so forth. So we sat together, Stuart and David and me and Richard Falk, Richard Barnett, and said, let's do something to break this pretext of the prisoners of war being responsible for our continuing the war, and take it away from the administration. And Stuart Meacham, grand Quaker gentleman, who I don't think had any diplomatic experience, but he had human experience, wrote an aide-memoire, which is dip talk for a memo, basically, to give to the other side. And there was something called the Logan Act, which you know about, from the 17th century, which said you're not allowed to, quote, negotiate with the enemy during hostilities. And we didn't want to spend the rest of our lives in jail. I had 3 children and a husband. So we made sure that we related to whatever we could say was a civil society organization, even though in a communist country that is kind of an anomaly. But they were the closest you could get to being civil society. And it was the Women's Union. And we wrote this aide-memoire to the Women's Union, offering to bring mail from American families of prisoners, of people who didn't come back. They didn't know if they were prisoners or not. Mail to them and mail back from them. And that way we would establish a list of who in fact was a prisoner of war, and we could start to calm the waters about they have thousands of our men and they're torturing them all. Torture goes with being a prisoner, so I'm not going to discuss the torture issue. So we created this memoir, we brought it over, they accepted it, and we created the Committee of Liaison with families of soldiers detained in North Vietnam. That was the Vietnamese title for the organization. We used the word prisoners of war. And it was the code for sending telegrams was Coliafam, C-O-L-I-A-F-A-M. And co in Vietnamese means miss. So when I would walk down the streets of Hanoi, after it became known that we were there, I was called Miss Liafam. And we did a number of things that have never been done before in times of war, I must say. And it was just because we were motivated by the need to break the back of this issue, but also we had a feeling. I mean, these were somebody's sons. They were all men. They were all pilots. They were all elite, because the only way you could get into a prison camp in North Vietnam was from the sky. You had to be shot down. And we negotiated, I don't want to use the word negotiate, we discussed with the Women's Union, to discuss with whoever they had to discuss with, can't we improve the mail for a letter a month, every month, and let them send mail back? And the mail that would come back would create the list of who was alive in a Vietnamese prison camp. Okay, they accepted that. And then we said, you only allowed 2 packages a year for Easter and Christmas. Can we improve the packages for the prisoners? Originally, I think it was 4 pounds a package. We got it up to 11 pounds, and it came more often, but I can't vouch for how many times it actually got in. And then we learned that, and we saw, that the American government was intercepting packages to prisoners of war on their way to the prison, on their way to Vietnam, and inserted sabotage material into the Wrigley's chewing gum or the Ivory soap or the Colgate toothpaste. Toothpaste was a favorite. So different parts that you could put together for communications, and things that could turn into code systems. I don't know anything about sabotage and codes, but we saw all this stuff. We saw where it came from, and we understood why there was a negative on packages. But if the mail came by hand from us, they would accept it. And if we took the mail back by hand and distributed it, they would do it once a month. Everybody wrote a letter except Eddie Alvarez, the first pilot who was shot down. And his sister was one of the strongest activists in the anti-war movement in California. He didn't want to have anything to do with us. So very quickly, for another minute, maybe, after we did this, from December 69 to the spring of 72, and then we went on a little bit in 73, we sent 3 Americans every single month, with the exception of 1 month, because they claimed there was so much bad weather that they couldn't travel in that month. I always thought it was political weather until I got there and was engaged and was involved in some of the terrible floods that happened. So we sent mail every month, we brought back lists, and we established the list. We brought back lists of the people who had been killed, either from parachuting down or died of wounds, so that we tried to stop the lies that were coming out of the Pentagon. And very quickly, as a result of that, in August of 72, I got a phone call from Paris, come immediately, and Dave Dellinger and I flew to Paris and were told that they were prepared to send 3 American pilots home, and would we put together a delegation to come and get them the following month. So Richard Falk, who has written, I gave you a list of resources, written the most brilliant legal analysis of this event of taking 3 pilots home during hostilities. Dick Falk, Richard Barnett from the Institute for Policy Studies, David Dellinger, no, Barnett didn't come with us, David Dellinger, Dick Falk, and Reverend William Sloane Coffin, and me. And then as we were getting onto the plane or going to the airport in Paris to come home, they sprung the news on us. They told us the names of the 3 pilots who were going to be released, and that we could bring their closest relative with us. And that was unheard of. So the mother of Mark Gartley came, Minnie Lee Gartley, who was an anti-war activist from Maine. He was a WASP from Maine. Charles, Norris Charles from California, an African-American from the West, and a guy named Edward Elias from the South. He was Jewish. Mary McGraw's story the next day was that the Vietnamese have written a balanced ticket. We had pretty interesting diversity. Anyway, we brought the 3 guys home, and that's a whole huge, long story full of adventure and drama. And the thank you that we got from Henry Kissinger was the Hanoi Haiphong bombing of 1972, Christmas bombing. So that's something that women can do. It's something that didn't happen before. And it might be an interesting book, Todd, to write about what civil society has done during the various wars that are different.
Feel free.
No, thank you. Anyway, thank you for everything you do, because whatever it is, it's better than doing nothing.
Thank you. Let me just make a quick comment, and that is that, again, is something of the moment that's sort of a little bit hard to bring if you are in this now, and that was the sense of the anti-war movement being in total opposition to the United States government.
Right.
It's not the case now. You know what I mean? The divisions within the government, et cetera. But for Cora and her colleagues to undertake negotiations with the other side, or discussions, not negotiations, was
statute of the art, right? You're right.
Was just an unheard of act of defiance of American governmental authority, and took extraordinary courage and steel to keep going on it. So, thank you for doing that.
I think of the other side too. The other side is that the Vietnamese who she negotiated, who she discussed it with, were not chanting death to America, and were smart about figuring out that there was a difference between American opinion that they wanted to cultivate.
They
and
taught
the
us.
government.
They taught us that you distinguish between the government and the people.
That's right. So
It's a very important lesson.
So for a number of movements that we're concerned about today, or where humanitarian crises are happening, regrettably, the governments and leadership of those countries are not necessarily as skillful, strategic, and wise as those Vietnamese skill and her talent, but also the skill and strategy of Vietnamese leadership that she dealt with.
One of whom read every single novel written by an American novelist. I mean, it was an extraordinary study of how well they understood the culture of this country.
Michael?
You've been taking me back.
Nostalgia.
No, not nostalgia, I assure you. Anything but. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But so 50 years ago, I was 17, and I was living to go to Mississippi in the summer of '64. That's what I had been doing for the last 3 years in Boston, organizing and learning from an amazing group of black leaders who mentored me, and I thought I was going to Mississippi. And
Everybody here okay?
so I thought I was going to Mississippi till my mother told me, no, you had to stay home and work because we needed the money. But I was lucky enough to get a job managing the insurgent campaign of a black social worker against the Speaker of the House, McCormick. I think we got 2%, but the point was to actually organize. And then that fall, I went to Harvard, determined to be part of a student movement and help organize a student organization. But first, I want to take you back. And for those of you who weren't born then, I want you to understand how different a time it was to organize. So let's just think about some of the things that are different. Well, let's start. There were no cell phones. There were no computers. There was no email. There was no social media. There were mimeograph machines, right? You had to type. There were typewriters. And not only was the technology different, but the politics and the culture of the time was different. So imagine you go to Harvard. One of the most popular courses was the end of ideology. There's no more conflict of ideologies in the world. 10,000 years of human civilization has been leading up to this society and American democratic capitalism, and we all know that as a given. The right wing of the country was in disarray. Hard to believe now. They weren't gone, and particularly in the South, they were very active in resisting, but the country as a whole seemed to be governed by a liberal consensus. So very different period. When we first started to put out leaflets about the war in Vietnam, and we said, here's a quote from the State Department, and here's a quote from Johnson, and then here are the facts showing that Johnson was lying about the war. At Harvard, the bastion of cosmopolitan, well-educated people, you know what the overwhelming reaction was that fall of '64? You might have a point about the war. You might. But the President of the United States never lies. Think about that. President of the United States never lies. It was a time when we had faith in our leaders. It was a time in which there was a consensus, apparently, about the direction of the country, and it was a liberal consensus. And there was a consensus about foreign policy, which was the Cold War. And it was quite clear there were only two sides, and you picked one or the other. Into that world came the war in Vietnam. And we were determined to oppose it. I want to step back for a moment, though, because I hear a lot about organizers today, and they talk about organizing a movement, organizing a social movement. That's what we're doing. We're organizing a social movement. You don't organize a social movement. I'm going to say things that sound completely contradictory, but they're not. I'm going to say both that you cannot organize a social movement into existence, and that organizing and leadership plays a critical role in the success or failure of a social movement once it comes into an existence. Social movements happen because of deep, profound political, social, cultural, economic, and political forces at work. And the way you know you're in one is when ordinary people step out of their ordinary lives and start doing non-ordinary things. and they become part of something larger than themselves. And you cannot will that into existence. You can't organize that into existence. In the 1960s, there were a series of social movements that overlapped and cascaded. There was the civil rights movement. There was a student movement, because you have to remember, this was this huge influx of young people, this demographic bulge pouring into rapidly expanding colleges and universities at a rate that had never been seen before, and which we all felt we were connected and part of each other. And then within that, there was the effort to build the new left. And then out of that came, in my view, largely the women's movement, and to a certain degree, the environmental movement. Those are movements, and then what we were doing in them was to try and organize. Now, quickly, because I only have a few more minutes, I want to just say, in the war, anti-war effort, you have to look at the period 64 to 68, and then 68 on. It's so strange for me looking back 50 years, because I think those were 20 years, right? I mean, so much happened. It was so remarkable. Every week brought tumultuous events, news, revelations, new understandings at a pace that's hard for us to comprehend. And of course, none of this was happening. Yes, there was television, yes, there was radio, but there wasn't the internet. And we had to find out things in a very hard way. 64 to 68, we are a tiny minority. Our job is to create a pole of opposition to the war in the midst of what seems to be a consensus society. So we do that, and what most people remember today are the demonstrations. And the demonstrations were critical, but they only came as part of a much larger effort. So many of the people in this room will know I spent most of my nights in college dorms. And I didn't go and say, come to a demonstration. I went and I sat with people and I said, what do you think your life is going to be like? What does it mean to be moral? What do you hope you're going to do when you graduate from college? What do you think about the war? What do you think about good Germans in Germany? We were preoccupied with good Germans. And out of that would come a far-ranging discussion in which sooner or later we would start talking about the war itself, the facts, the history, the understanding, and the need not to acquiesce. And slowly, we would win people over. It took time. We had systems in most of the campuses. By 66, most of the campuses in New England, we had a dorm system where every week we put a leaflet, mimeographed or stenciled, under the door of every single room in virtually every college across New England, talking about the war. It was that kind of effort, the posters, the singing, the parties, the arguing in classes whenever there was a class where we could raise an issue, that then when you held the demonstration, what was the purpose of the demonstration? The purpose of the demonstration was always to draw a line, to force people to choose. And we knew that the minority were going to choose to be with us, and that the majority were going to be outraged, but two things would happen. The minority would stick with us and change their lives, and the majority would want to have a debate with us. So organize, educate, reach out, demonstrate. Force a choice. Then do it all again and again and again. 64, 68, we go through this whole process of debate, of teach-ins. The government says, yes, we'll send representatives to debate the war. They lose the debates. They say, no, we won't send anybody. We go through a process in which we start by thinking maybe the war's a mistake. And then we learn systematically it's not a mistake. It's part of a foreign policy. It has happened before. We suddenly learn about Mossadegh in Iran. We learn about Arbenz in Guatemala. We begin to see it as systematic, and we begin to see that we're fighting something much deeper, and we're not going to get there by an argument, but we have to get there by mobilizing more and more people in a whole diversity of ways. I need to end, but I need to tell you the problem was we were young. We were young. Okay. We were young. One of the tragedies is we had no mentors. We didn't have people to teach us. For instance, I told Miles this. One of the things that I find just amazing, I worked every day against the war from 1964 into 1975. The first time I had a serious discussion about how the war would actually end, not the demands, right, but how would it end? How would the United States actually end the war? Was 1970. Now, we just never thought about how it would end. We thought, okay, the demand, end it, withdraw. But how does that happen? Oh, maybe Congress has to cut off funding. Oh, maybe there has to be some legislation. No. We were young. We also saw everything changing around us so fast. People murdered, the very public assassinations that you all know about, but also private ones. And, you know, my experience was not in any way abnormal. There were two detectives, one in Boston and one in Cambridge. I don't remember the one in Boston's name, but the one in Cambridge was Scalise, whose major joy in life seemed to be turning on his sirens whenever he saw us walking down the street, throwing his car across the sidewalk, jumping out, taking out the biggest gun I've ever seen in my life, putting it to my head and saying, "You motherfucking maggot, one of these nights when no one's around, I'm going to blow your fucking head off." And you just stood there because what could you do, right? That was not abnormal. Why am I going through all this? Because every day we woke up 18, 19, 20 years old thinking, if we don't succeed, more people are going to die today. That, coupled with our youth, meant that when we got to the pivotal years of 68 and 69, and I'm not denigrating, by the way, the government's efforts to disrupt us and mislead us, but I think they were unnecessary. We would have done it to ourselves anyway. By 68, the following is happening. Because the war is not going the way the Americans wanted it to go, because we are not winning the war, obviously, because the casualty rate is high, because of the very visible and shocking Tet Offensive, a majority of the country turns against the war. At that point, we needed to understand how to lead a majority movement. And we were so entrenched, so young, so traumatized by everything that had happened, we thought the right thing to do is when everybody came over. So, for example, Boston Globe, simple thing, Boston Globe. 1965, Boston Globe writes an editorial saying the rabble across the river is protesting against the war. They are un-American, unpatriotic. 1968, they are proud to be one of the leading editorial views against the war. We should have embraced that and understood how to lead it. Instead, we thought we needed to move 2 steps to the left to continue to pull people further and further towards change. So much had happened that was unimaginable, we started to think anything could happen. Can't. Anything cannot happen. And the result was we failed critically in the years 68, 69, 70, at the very moment that the biggest demonstrations were happening, at the very moment that the country turned against the war, at the very moment that returning veterans organized against the war, at the very moment that blue-collar communities became mobilized against the war, we abdicated any chance of leadership and behaved in a way that was futile, if for some of us, reprehensible for others of us. And I think the result is that we have left a void in American politics ever since. I'll say one last thing. How does the war look to me now, 50 years later? I am more bitter about it today than I was then. I didn't think that was possible. Because not only do I think that it ruined the lives of so many Americans, took the lives of 50,000, murdered over 1 million Vietnamese, crippled probably 2 million, but it also distorted our politics to the day that we still feel now. And it killed any chance, to go to Danny's point, any chance of the project that we started out with in 63, 64, 65, which was to create a democratic new left that was rooted in American realities, that understood and talked in an American language, and would be able to extend American democracy in new and profound ways. And I think the war killed that. And it's just another reason that I am so unrelentingly opposed to the war in Vietnam. Let me stop.
Thank you to all of you. I think I want to proceed in the following way, and that is first to allow the young people in the room, so to speak, to make a comment, ask a question, get clarification, etc. And then sort of open up to people who were in that moment with us to add their perspective and point of view. So let me start by saying if there are any questions or comments from the young people in the audience. You don't have to, but if you want to, this will be the time. You can come back later. Any questions, any comments? Yes, go ahead, take the mic.
First off, I just want to say thank you. This was very exciting to listen to, and I think I'm thinking a lot of thoughts, but the one that's loudest right now is I have friends who returned from the war in Afghanistan as a veteran and being very much rejected by friends who were against the war when he left for it. And
So sad.
I know it's not a unique experience, and I just want to know what was that feel like in the Vietnam War, and what could be changed and what can we learn?
It's very complicated. There's a myth that very commonly GIs came back from Vietnam and they were spat upon by anti-war activists. This did not happen. This did not happen. A sociologist named Jerry Lemke actually went and looked at the contemporaneous record. You'd think that if this had happened, somebody would have reported it. Somebody would have written a letter to the paper expressing resentment of it. Didn't happen. Never happened. Yeah, there were a lot of angry people who were not the core of the anti-war movement, who were very angry and had to learn to distinguish between the war and the warrior. But they did learn. And so it did happen by 1969-70 that I think the conventional wisdom in the anti-war movement was that the soldiers were our allies. And if not actually, they could come to be that. It's, I think, grotesque that somebody comes out of, that a veteran comes out of Iraq or Afghanistan and is treated as a pariah. I mean, that to me is depressing news.
Also, I would just, I'd just say, in my experience, I completely agree with what Todd said. I mean, in 1969, what we were doing was organizing on state and community colleges throughout New England, specifically to reach veterans who were returning and going to those schools, and then through those veterans trying in our confused way to organize back into the communities. But many of the veterans that we worked with went on to found Vietnam Veterans Against the War. But what I would say is, I don't think I have any earth-shaking advice except the obvious, which is, I think you and other people need to say to your friends who are treating the returning soldier poorly, you have to make a distinction between the war and the warrior. You have to make a distinction between the people who give the orders and the people who follow the orders. And that, the victims of war are absolutely often as much the soldiers who fight as the civilians and others who are harmed. You can make the case that they've chosen to do that, okay, but it's still, they've usually chosen for very good reasons. And the only other thing I would say is my brief experience with veterans over the years has been usually it's most helpful for veterans to work with other veterans. And I would urge you to try and get your friend to talk to other veterans.
If I could just add a footnote. I said this was a moral movement, which is obvious. The downside of moral movements is smugness. It's the belief that we chosen few get it, and you, the unenlightened, don't. We're superior. That's not politics. It's something else. That's high school.
Michael?
Well, I'm just going to say, just to open for discussion, I think one of the things that goes to what Todd and Michael were saying, but I think you can't underestimate the role that the draft had in all this too, the difference between what's happening now and what happened then. Because the one or acceptance the fact we had this vast pool of young men who were susceptible to being sent over there.
It's a big difference. It's not, by the way, it's not just a big difference because the individual person faces the draft. It's that their family, their friends, everybody knows that the cost of the war is going to be borne, usually by a very broad section, particularly the lower income blue-collar families. Whereas today, what the volunteer army does is get that out and create this bizarre disconnect between 98% of the country and the 2% of the families whose soldiers are over there. And I do believe you're right. I think it is not accurate to say that there would have been no opposition to the war if the draft hadn't been there. But I think it is equally accurate.
There was already an opposition to the war on the part of people who were exempt from the draft.
Right.
Because we were students.
But I think it's equally true to say that if there was a draft today, things would be profoundly different in terms of foreign policy.
Just to add a moment to it, it's again tough to imagine now, but every single young man at the time, not out of fear, but had to grapple with the question of what do I do, and the families. Do I go and fight in a war that I consider to be absolutely unjust? Do I resist? I mean, think about the Clinton campaign. Do I resist and throw away my future and drop out? Do I go to Canada? And these were all sort of like huge existential questions that individuals faced, and their significant others and their families, et cetera, that that just brought that war home to every single family all the time.
But also, go ahead, Tom.
No, just one. I have a whole barnyard of canards that need to be disrupted. There's another canard about the Antiwar movement was that the university-based part of it was quite fine with working class kids going off to fight. We were just saving our own asses. Well, you guys in Boston actually did, I think, the best. I don't know if you were involved in that effort in some working class area, that we were obsessed in SDS anyway with the class injustice of the draft system. We actually, one of our guys actually uncovered the memorandum that the draft chief had drafted called Channeling, which was about which we published, which was about the deliberate use of the draft in order to channel young people toward socially necessary professions while sending the riffraff off to die. And we were really, just as we were acutely aware of our privileges, I would say. And there was an effort in Boston, I think chiefly, to actually to make a point of trying to organize white, primarily working class kids. We did some of it in Chicago. Also precisely to demonstrate that we were not lording it over them, and we were not fine with sending them off as our substitutes in the Civil War sense.
I was just going to say one other thing, if I could, which is because Miles, what you said about the decisions that people had to face, they also had to face them in a lesser way all the time. I mean, I remember talking to a guy who now runs a wonderful organization in D.C., Bob Greenstein, And Greenstein said what changed his life was when he finally made the decision to get on the bus to go to Washington. And that he paced up and down and up and down and up and down because he thought, if I do this, my whole life is probably going to be changed. So think about the Dow sit-ins or the South Africa or any of the ones that we do. You didn't know, are you going to be thrown out of college if you do this? Should I be thrown out of college? Am I willing to risk that?
Or should I leave?
Should I leave? But at every point, people were encountering these questions which were profoundly moral and profoundly about their lives. It wasn't just the war in Vietnam. It was, how do we live as moral people in this world in these times? And those decisions, and so part of it is having those moments are important to building the organization and the movement. Having the moment when you have to decide, am I getting on the bus or aren't I? Am I sitting in or aren't I? Am I distributing literature or aren't I? Every one of those moments is critical to involving people and having them choose to be part of something larger than themselves.
Peter?
The moral dilemmas were not just about getting into the war. The moral dilemmas arose for the soldiers once they got to Vietnam, and for the pilots once they were told, to fly over and push the button and drop the bombs, and how many civilians was that going to kill? Or the guy who was supposed to empty a flamethrower, into a hole and burn a bunch of Vietnamese to death. I mean, that's what created the veterans movement. But they must have been just unimaginably difficult moral choices for them to make.
We have to go soon.
It wasn't like the Great War, World War II.
And I want to try to link a couple of things that have been said here. One of the most important things that happened in the Vietnam War were the teach-ins. And mere mortals taught students and others what the issues were. And they were responsible for a huge mobilization and a huge intelligence that took place. I don't want to go through that again. I don't want to have this conversation again. I want to have a time when the failure of war is turned into the abolition of war. I think war has failed as an institution. And I think it's very important to turn this conversation before everybody leaves into what are we going to do to abolish war as an institution. I think that time has come, and we really, really have to put our heads together and figure out how it's going to happen. Because the communities that we work with, whether it's equality or racism or trade unions or Occupy, they all have a common interest in seeing no more violence and seeing no more of our kids going to fight and be killed or kill. It's a huge cause of an economic deficit. The price of war, morally, economically, humanly, medically, is just it's unimaginary. I mean, it's unimaginable. And it's time for it to stop. And we have to start thinking in those terms. I mean, it's very nice to tell stories about the past, and I enjoyed it. But I'm devoting my time now to peace education and to getting women at every decision-making table. And, I think we can all do that and do everything else we want to do, everything else that we love. But we've got to begin to feel some passion about this war culture that is doing nothing but economically destroying us and making us the enemy of a lot of people.
I'm sitting here thinking, as a social worker, people like you people. I want to improve the world, I want to do away with war. But one of the themes that I've been hearing here is tragedy, you know, and hubris, you know, not being able to do what's called for at the time that it's called for. That action involves making decisions that ultimately, in hindsight, might be tragic, you know.
Well, I mean, yes, and no. So, you know, I think when you have the vantage point of 50 years, you look back and you say, okay, here are the things that we were unable to do that should have been done. But I think you need to look deeper and understand why we were unable to do it. And so if the question is, for example, do I regret the work to oppose the war? Absolutely not. My only regret is that I couldn't do it better. But, you know, 17, 18, 19, 20, I mean, now I'd probably do it a lot better, which gives me to one final point, which is, you know, to build a little bit on what Cora's saying, I also think it is so important, and this is why, Miles, I think it's really important that you do these things. We didn't have the benefit of learning from, or at least we chose not to. I don't know whether we did. Some of each. But we did learn from the people who'd gone before us. I know for myself, I felt nothing but disdain for the old left and all of their orthodoxies and so on. And I think even if all we have to teach is to learn from the things we didn't do well, and then maybe occasionally the things that we did, and to give people who are young today a glimpse of what it means to be part of something larger than yourself, then I think it's really incumbent on us to keep trying to do that in whatever forms and whatever ways. So hats off again to Miles.
All right. Well, all right, Cora and Peter have to go, but I actually don't want to end this prematurely. I want to thank you.
Thanks. Great to see you,
Keep
Cora.
doing.
Peter, thank you.
Don't knock yourself so hard.
All right, and if we end war between now and 8:15, we'll call you and tell you.
One, I think it was evident on February, 2003, when we had, whatever it was, 1 million people on First Avenue against the coming of the Iraq War, that this was not only a beginning and an end, and the reason was that nothing we did was going to stop the war. The Bush people were absolutely batshit set on it. And it was such a different sort of war. It wasn't the slog of Vietnam with the bodies coming back every week. It was a sort of, wargasm, and then it was over. So the opportunity to create the movement, there were other problems as well. But the second thing that's staggeringly different has already been alluded to. This is a volunteer army. And they can fight these wars with impunity. And it doesn't tear the society apart. There's something really unnerving about the ability of this fabulously wealthy, fabulously well-equipped country to pursue wars, all kinds of wars, while life goes on. And, in part that was also true. That was a perception I frequently had during the Vietnam War, which frequently drove me crazy. It's the horror that business goes on as usual. And yet, what happened over time, because of a learning process that took place throughout the society, is that growing numbers of people, and eventually majorities, felt both empowered and disempowered at once. The empowerment was you could see the thing growing, and you could watch you could watch change. Now, it wasn't all change you wanted. Nixon abolished the draft. Nixon lowered the voting age to 18. And all kinds of other reforms were taking place, even under Nixon. So you didn't feel completely stuck. in some way, it's true that the movement then started as a pathetic minority. I mean, at the time when the anti-war movement began, depending on which polls you go by, the war received 70–80% popularity. We represented about 12% of the population at first. Then it grew. But in this case, we're starting with a different political situation in which the war making today does not require legitimacy, political legitimacy.
All right, I want to go around. Let us go for about 15 minutes, but I want to make sure that everybody who has a comment to make gets the chance to make it. Alex?
Yeah, I totally agree with.
And I think I'm going to pass the microphone around. So I'm ready. Alex?
Thank you. I generally agree with Michael's analysis about the 68, post-68 period. But let's not forget, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the Chicago police riot did happen. I mean, there are a lot of things that intervened that were in a straight line from 65 and 66, building opinion and then reaping the benefits of it. I think in the end, the anti-war movement was successful in turning a majority against the war and turning that opinion into legislative action. I mean, the bombing in Cambodia was stopped because Congress cut off the money. And Nixon, listening to the tapes, Nixon and Kissinger weren't very happy about that. Even as late as the Ford administration and the Meyer incident, Kissinger wanted to go back in and start bombing again because the decent interval wasn't long enough. So I think there was a lot of success that happened. I think the McGovern candidacy in '72 was a very powerful expression of that. And had Robert Kennedy not been assassinated, whether Gene McCarthy or Kennedy might have been able to do that in '68, I think history might have been very different. I realize you can't go back and, say what if, but I think the growth of anti-war opinion did have an enormous impact. It was interrupted by some severe, tragic events that couldn't really have been predicted or foreseen. And in the end, I think popular opinion did stop the war, unfortunately later than any of us would have hoped. But I think it did have that impact. And all the talk later on about the Vietnam syndrome just showed it had a continuing resonance, stopping interventions in the future that might have been tried. So I think the record is a little bit more mixed, and I think some of the activities of the anti-war movement in '72 with the Indochina Peace Campaign and stuff really did find a way to capture a lot of that sort of feeling in which patriotic Americans against the war was the common sort of theme. I remember us at the IPC Philadelphia working with relatives of the prisoners of war to get the relatives of the prisoners of war to join us in asking that the war be ended. And I thought that was a very good expression of what had changed.
Go ahead. Sure.
I think hold.
Okay.
Let everybody get a chance. The two of you will get a last comment, and then, of course, I will make the last comment. As is my right as president of the team.
But of course.
This is a question mainly for Michael, because I know something about his history after the Vietnam War ended. So I want to ask how you relate the citizen action movement to the activism, the changing opinions of the public through the anti-Vietnam War movement. There's several people sitting around this table that were part of citizen action, and Michael founded Fair Share in Massachusetts.
Okay, given that's a direct question, you may.
No, I'll roll it in. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
I got
I
it.
just wanted to add, I think there's an economic component that makes that period different than this period. This was happening at the end of a long period of economic expansion, and it created a kind of expansiveness of thinking, I think. And especially for young kids in college, they weren't really so worried about their personal economic fate. In fact, they were afraid they would get a boring job, not that they wouldn't get a job. And I think that promoted a certain utopianism, and not just in the left. I mean, I think parts of the Johnson administration really thought they were going to end poverty and do it in just a couple of years. So there was a sense of anything being possible. And Michael's point was a good one. That could get you in trouble, too. That's so different than the last 10, 15, 20 years when, personal and social economic problems are so immediate. There's some sense of stagnation. And it's kind of dampened any utopianism. There are little flashes of it around Occupy. But it's so hard, I think, for people to imagine some profoundly different life that they themselves might actually live. Whereas that was common currency, in 1966. And I think that is a very different setting, and it's a more difficult setting, it seems to me. So I think we may have failed, but in other ways we had it easier, I think, than a lot of people do today.
Well, you just said exactly what I was going to say, so I need to say it.
So I agree. Michael said that the movement consists both of a broad sentiment in the country, which is enhanced by organization. You said it better than that, but that was the general point. And it raises the question for many people who have tried to put themselves in a social justice perspective as to what the role of organization is in the context of where mobilization is not as great or seems to be absent in this particular way that you talk about movements. But that's more of an academic question. The really interesting question is, what to me is, where was their strength in the organizations that arose in the Eisenhower period or in the beginning of the civil rights movement on which the movement may have drawn? Because that would give us some interesting insight, I think, into the role of organization before the population is mobilized.
So thank you to the panelist. I guess I'm just thinking about this kind of like the big picture, right, of like kind of repressive and anti-democratic systems. And so I think of immediately, I went to a talk 2 nights ago on stop and frisk. And there were very few people there because I think that people think now like, oh, well, we're not going to have stop and frisk anymore, which is not the case. It's just going to be different. And so I feel in a sense that there was this movement, but now I'm worried that there's going to be a sense of complacency. And so then how do, you all were strategists and involved, like how do we keep the fire, keep the momentum, get people involved, continue to push to get where we really want to be and not someplace that's just a little bit better?
I can talk that, Mike. I'm confident of that. I'm really fascinated by this question of continuity, Michael, that you raised, right? This notion that, the new left became the ultra left. I think that's what you were always saying, 69, 70, 71. At a time when they commanded majority support, separated themselves, out of anger and frustration and, I think one of the things that you guys have communicated, that all the panelists have communicated, is that the intensity, and I was 15 years younger, but the intensity of the sense of desperation that people felt about being unable to stop what was going on, right? And that led to, but it seemed to me what you were suggesting was, there was a generation of 25 years older who had built the largest mass left in America that you guys weren't talking to, right? And I saw that kind of replicated, I thought, during Occupy. This little moment of utopianism had contempt for those of us who had essentially failed, my generation, your generation, the last 30 years, fighting neoliberalism and losing, right? They're like, you have nothing to teach us, right? And it's a revolutionary moment. I mean, we literally had this debate in my office with 10 occupiers, and I said, it's not a revolutionary moment. And people were like, aghast, And so I just sort of wish you would, sort of both of you would comment on this question of continuity and discontinuity. People you know, I really felt like, and actually, I'll finish with one story. I mean, very coincidentally, I was meeting in my office with some people, you know, some 55, 57-year-old organizers, 58-year-old organizers. Jesse Jackson comes to town, comes to the meeting, and says, the occupiers, you need to hire some staff and win some shit. You know, you need to, like, we had staff, we won Medicare, we won Medicaid. That's what you need to do. Nobody's really listening, you know. So I think that to me, that question of continuity and discontinuity in the left is something that's really fascinating. I'm curious about your observations.
Okay. Anybody else?
Someone back there.
I just have one little sort of question. I've been puzzling, you know, and maybe I have a warped perspective now, but, you know, back in the day, you know, we were all like activists on our own time, you know? I mean, maybe it's because so many of us were in school and sometimes for so long. But nowadays, you know, there is like a whole industry called philanthropy, and those guys don't know the difference between charity and activism and social change. And I just wonder whether you have any thoughts about whether we can really have, you know, whether a movement for social justice and social change can actually happen as a professional operation, and whether, in fact, it can happen without a professional operation. Ooh, is that the dialectic? Okay.
All right, Jeff, last comment, then last final words from the front.
I was struck by some of the argument that said, you know, the anti-war movement was made possible by sort of the combination of moral fervor and personal stakes. The draft. People could die. People could be drafted. People had to make life consequential choices all the time because of it, driven by the intensity of moral fervor. You know, it's hard to see where those conditions exist anymore. Except maybe in the movement against climate change, which might be the one thing which actually poses personal life stakes to large numbers of people that they may experience in their lifetime, in their time horizon. But in the absence of that, one of the things that strikes me is that it also suggests that the tactics of mass mobilization, direct action, direct personal risk-taking, if they need to be driven by intense moral fervor and personal stakes, if that doesn't exist, we need to be thinking completely about new tactics, and which I think gets to where Donna's question was. The citizen action movement was trying to redirect a sense of revolutionary goals, zeal, into, you know, democratic participation, voting, community organizing, and lobbying, and so on, which, you know, rather than a come down, may in fact be the most appropriate tactics until conditions reoccur where personal stakes and moral fervor rise again. So that was, I'm thinking about that, and it was one of the observations I had in what you were saying.
3 quick points. First of all, about organizations. There were 2 kinds of organizations before Kennedy, before the 60s, that mattered. And they were quite different. One was what was called the Leadership Council on Civil Rights, in which the leadership of every civil rights organization, from the most staid, like the Urban League, to the most militant, like SNCC. They were all, well, SNCC didn't exist till 1960, but this infrastructure was set up earlier in the 50s, and there was a consultation. There was coordination. There was also difference. There was disagreement. The NAACP was chastised for being too lawyerly, too hung up on the courts, and so on and so on. These arguments went on, but there was I don't know what the right metaphor is, a sort of a quilt that held a lot of project. So yes, philanthropy was far less engaged at the time, but there were philanthropists who were part of this network and who actually were quite crucial in, for example, investing in voter registration in 1961. The other kind of organization that exists were little squads of fanatical pacifists,
right,
who tried to stop nuclear submarines from being launched in New London, Connecticut, and so on. And there were overlaps. I mean, people like Bayard Rustin actually sort of had a foot in both worlds. They were important, I would argue. They were handfuls of people. But I know myself as a student just getting involved in the movement against the nuclear weapons, it registered with me that there were people who really prepared to go the Gandhian way, and just as it mattered that there had been core organizers organizing freedom rides in 1947. So that's one point. Second point, I think I agree with you that climate change has the potential to be an amalgamating goad, a sort of declaration of shared emergency that hits a lot of different people in different ways, but I think just in the last year or two has demonstrated that it can galvanize people, and I've been myself galvanized by it in the last year, so I sort of, and I know a number of others, so I think that is significant. But I just want to say one thing about the problem of the late 60s, because I want to take a slight issue with the way you formulated the problem of what happened in 1968 to 72. It wasn't that there was desperation. It wasn't that there was anger. It's that there was stupidity. The thing that personally always galled me and still galls me about these idiots of the Weather Underground is that they had the gall to assume that they were the only people who hated the Vietnam War, and that if you didn't go with them, your passion was not finely enough tuned. That was bullshit. They were people with horrible, stupid ideas. And I have a lot of affection for the Occupy organizers. Sorry? And I have a lot of affection for the Occupy core, who had crazy and stupid ideas, but I think it has to be accepted, I certainly came to accept at a certain point, that they had not only stupid ideas, but they weren't going to be talked out of them, because having those ideas was their identity, it was who they were. That poses a problem, and the problem is different from the Weather Underground problem, because there is this subterranean stream of live for the moment anarchism, which actually comes and goes throughout the last century in America. And it had its foot in the 60s also. And it has its pleasures, it has its satisfaction, it has its payoffs for the people who are into it. And, bless them in a lot of ways. They did create a lot of dinner table conversations. It can't be left to them. I mean, I think I felt with them at a certain point, it was pointless to argue with them because they were just going to do their thing. And the thing was, what was incumbent upon us, as was often incumbent on lots of different people with lots of different views in the 60s, was to find your own thing to do that somehow was compatible, it comported with who you were and what you could do, to have a full service movement. There was something for everybody. If you wanted to sit down in front of a freight train, we have a group for you, and if you want to write letters to your congressman, we have a group for you.
Mike?
I think that the anti-war movement was far more effective than it felt. But therein lies a world of difference. I mean, the fact that we did what we did and ended a war, toppled governments, and freed political prisoners is pretty amazing. But it didn't feel that way. And so the heritage that gets passed on is not a heritage of success and of strategy. So that's one. The second thing that's amazing is if you look at the people who were involved in the anti-war movement and in SDS and the student movement, what you don't see is a lot of people. I mean, there were few. Who was that guy who became Reagan's budget officer?
David Stockman.
I mean, there are few who went on to become, right-wing apostates.
I mean, he was a libertarian.
He was a libertarian, yeah. So there were few, and there are some who probably went on to head businesses and so on. But if you look, certainly many, many people that I know have gone on to try and continue to make a contribution in one way or another, that, many people around this table, but many, 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 many more. That doesn't get us off the hook, because when I talk about the failures of the period, it's not just the Weather Underground. I mean, it's also, and it's not just the Progressive Labor Party. I mean, you think about all these people that I knew at Harvard who were the sons and daughters of wealthy people, who were really nice people, and suddenly, I remember John Mayer, my good buddy, put out a leaflet describing me as a CIA agent, and I said to him, Johnny, you know me. How can I be a CIA agent? And he said, well, you're not a CIA agent in the sense that they've hired you, but objectively, you're doing what they want you to do, therefore you are. I mean, talk about crazy.
Liz, cross them off the donor list.
So, no, don't.
That was during the period when that was the PL line. I remember seeing an issue of their newspaper.
Right.
It said, Marcuse, cop out or cop?
Right. So, and then you go broader. So, some of us were not with the Weatherground, and we weren't in PL, but we did not rise to the occasion. So to go to Donna's,
right.
it took us 5 years to figure out how to try to seriously organize. And so what you get with Citizen Action, with Fair Share, and lots of other organizations, 9 to 5 and others, is what you're getting is a two-part reverberation from the anti-war movement, the student movement, and the New Left. Reverberation one is people who are devoting themselves to being organizers and learning that profession, learning that skill, and taking it seriously and getting over all the confusions about leadership and structure and accountability. The second thing is we're organizing people who have been profoundly affected by watching all of this. And so, for instance, in East Boston, I remember talking to the women who started opposing the airport. And I said to them, why'd you start doing this? And they said, well, because we saw, I will leave out the word, those people sitting in the South and sitting in doing things here, and we figured if they can cause trouble and get results, we can cause trouble and get results. So there was a lesson that was being learned. But what didn't happen was at the moments when we could have, I think, we wouldn't have built a powerful, lasting movement with, say, 40% of the electorate. Because social tides come and they go, right? And that one was going to go. But we could have kept the ground that was captured much higher, and we could have created a wing of American politics that we have lacked for the last 40 years. Okay, final point. So I think there's a big difference between when you're young and when you're not. So when you're young, now, yes, you still have to worry about your college debts, but you're not paying the mortgage, and you're not worried about yet where your kids are going to go to school and all those things. And that's why students and young people are so often the activists and the most important spearhead. I will say, now I'm old, and I've learned two things. I can say this, right? One is, I have learned that I am too flawed to be able to tell people what to do. When I was young, I was arrogant. I thought, of course I can lead. There's no question about it. And now I go, no, I can't. But I still believe in two things. One is I believe that the pathway to change, to the society we want, has to go through large democratic schools. You can't get to a deeper, richer democracy by telling people to get there. They have to experience it, and they have to experience what it means to be a full democratic citizen, and they have to acquire the tools to be that. and to be educated and self-confident and organized. So we need still to create those massive schools, but they have to be on a scale that matters. The second thing is, for those of you who are old like me, we're coming into a very interesting time in our lives. We're not going to have jobs. We may not have mortgages. And I think there's an interesting question about whether this generation, ours, that was active in the 60s, will simply fade out without a whimper, possible, probable, or whether lots of us will decide when we don't have that mortgage and the kids are through college and the grandkids are looking at their future, that it's time for us to make a modest contribution to living up to the values that we had to begin with. I kind of hope that. I don't know that I believe it, but I kind of hope it. I know I won't be leading it, but I'd sure like to participate in it. And I'd sure like to be able to have young people lead it and let us old people help you out. So thank you.
Amen.
Well, I have about 45 minutes worth of comments, but I'll save them, I guess. But I want to say I want to emphasize the continuity in two respects, and I'm sort of talking to the Demos folks in a way. There's a micro continuity and there's a macro continuity that I see and think we can build on. The micro continuity is that, just sort of listening to the people who have been through it and whatever, there was a cohort that was created that was in the anti-war movement, in the citizen action movement, in a variety of activism, who had a set of values and decided that they were going to live by them. Living by them did not mean, being a full-time, out in the streets activist, but it did mean taking those values into wherever you were, whether you became a social worker or a scientist or a, teacher or a professional organizer, which some of us did, and the relationships that were built and the value synchronicity that was built, I think has lasted people. And I think Michael is absolutely right that, the people who are here, but thousands of others, changed their lives at that time and are still doing things today that matter. And I see, and I think to the Demos people, there is a cohort being created today. It's not a Demos cohort because it's too small, but if you think about it, and it's the Citizen Action of New York, and it's the Working Families Party, and it's the Citizens, the Center for Popular Democracy. I got to keep up with the names, and all of these things. It's in the building. It's in the people that the Building Movement Project is working with. It's and that's a cohort that I think has tremendous potential, which brings me to the macro point, which is I see every day in the Demos staff, the people that we work with, et cetera, the same sense of idealism and commitment to a larger set of goals and to wanting to live those goals that I saw 40 years ago in the people that I worked with then. And I think that it's a wonderful and kind of inspiring piece of what we can do. And I think you've heard me say this, but nothing you do is wasted, but keep these relationships and the cohortness, and I think it can matter. And in the macro sense, I do think that we are in a very different period, but I also think we're in a period where there is real possibility. I do think that and I've said it before, the neoliberal moment has passed. The Tea Party and the ultra-right are the flailing, the flailing tail end of that movement. I think the moment that we're in is not yet defined, but I think there's more opportunity and more sense that the inequality levels that we have, do we really want to be a $10 an hour or an $8 an hour economy? Do we really want to have a national, a military budget that is the size of what we need when we're not even fighting, when those wars, which were limited by Vietnam syndrome, I believe, are winding down? Anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that there isn't the fierce intensity that existed at the time, but there are plenty of issues that people can devote themselves to and their lives to and write about passionately and act on. So I think it's a great moment, and I think that my doing this series is a way of sort of trying to help create that continuity and build those relationships cross-generationally. And I will say, to your last point, Michael, that as people know, I'm going to Common Cause in a month. But one of my hopes at Common Cause is to create an organization which can have the vibrancy and the internet savvy and the of the young people, and also bring the best of the generation that we come from into it, and figure out if we can blend that into something that really matters and gets to scale. So anyway, thank you very much for being here. Thanks to Cora. Thanks to all of you. It was a great night.